Yevgeny Kafelnikov, two men's Grand Slam titles, Olympic champion. The first Russian tennis player to become world number one. The man who opened an entire new era for Russian tennis. From his historic victories on the clay courts of Paris to the moments standing on the highest podium in Sydney, he conquered the biggest stages of world sports with iron discipline, cold will, and a competitive spirit that almost never knew surrender. Millions of fans remember him as a symbol of perseverance, resilience, and success. The pioneer who changed the status of Russian tennis forever. But behind those glories is a story that is not glorious but painful. A childhood nurtured more by discipline than by hugs. The years of growing up amid the collapse of the Soviet Union. The prolonged loneliness on trips around the world while still too young. A broken marriage. Tense legal battles to keep his daughter by his side, and the pain that no title could soothe when witnessing his only child getting caught up in scandals and crises that the whole country talked about. The public always saw a cold Yevgeny Kafelnikov, a man who rarely smiled, rarely complained, rarely showed emotion. On the court, he was the embodiment of absolute control, an opponent that even the greatest champions of the generation had to watch out for. But after those victories were long, sleepless nights, were the silences that no audience had ever seen, were the quiet anxieties of a father who felt helpless in the face of his own daughter's life. Many years after retirement, the world was surprised to see Kafelnikov publicly express despair on social media. The man who had once defeated the strongest opponents in the world now could not protect his most beloved from the storms of life. And that was perhaps the most painful moment in his entire journey. Because the biggest matches had ended long ago, the trophies had been awarded, the cheers had faded into the past. But the hardest battle was still ahead. And now, when looking back on his life from the peak of Russian tennis history, what is really happening with Yevgeny Kafelnikov behind that silence? What has made the man who once conquered the whole world carry so many wounds throughout his life? Before we turn back time to explore the boy who became a tennis legend of Russia, please hit like and subscribe to the channel as a token of gratitude to the man who carried the dream of an entire nation on his shoulders, but still silently endured pains that no one saw. And please stay until the end of the video, because Yevgeny Kafelnikov's story is not just the journey of a champion, but also a story of losses, sacrifices, and battles that even the strongest cannot win easily. It is heartbreaking to realize that the source of so much pain in Yevgeny Kafelnikov's life did not begin on the tennis court, nor did it begin from failures or upheavals of adulthood. It began long before the whole world knew his name, before the Grand Slam titles, before the world number one ranking, before the Olympic gold medal, before the cheers of millions of fans. It began with a boy living by the Black Sea in the city of Sochi, where childhood was not measured by games or happy vacations, but by long training hours and heavy expectations placed on shoulders that were still too small. Yevgeny Kafelnikov was born on February 18, 1974 in Sochi, a famous resort city of the former Soviet Union. From the outside, life there seemed more peaceful than many other regions of that vast country. But behind the beauty of the palm-lined beaches and sunny roads was a life that was not easy for ordinary working families. The Soviet Union at that time was entering its final years. The economic system was facing increasing difficulties. Many families struggled to meet even the most basic needs. In that context, Yevgeny's father, Alexander Kafelnikov, placed all his faith in sports. He was not only a father, but also his son's first coach. And from then on, Yevgeny's childhood began to differ from other children. While many boys his age ran and played on the beach or frolicked with friends after school, Yevgeny often appeared on the tennis court very early. Cold mornings began with physical exercises, long afternoons with hundreds of repeated strokes until the sun set. No easy praise, no special rewards. Only one requirement repeated every day: must be better than yesterday, must be stronger than yesterday, must win. Alexander Kafelnikov believed that talent was not enough to create a champion. Discipline was what decided everything. So he treated his son more like an athlete than a child. Small mistakes were all pointed out. Signs of weakness were rarely accepted. Tears brought no sympathy. Many years later, those who knew the Kafelnikov family remembered Alexander as a father strict to the point of being terrifying. But in his mind, that was the only way to help his son survive in a world full of competition. Then, as the years passed, the boy Yevgeny began to learn a dangerous lesson. That emotion should be kept hidden. That pain must be endured alone. That if he wanted to be respected, he was not allowed to let others see him hurt. While peers rejoiced over small victories, Yevgeny often just quietly packed his things and prepared for the next training session. When he failed, he was not allowed to complain. He just returned to the practice court and continued. Gradually, silence became the most familiar refuge for that boy. The final years of the Soviet Union made life even more difficult. Shortages were everywhere. Training equipment was insufficient. Youth competitions often had to save every penny in costs. There were times when the future became so uncertain that no one knew what lay ahead. But it was in that situation that tennis became the family's only hope. Each of Yevgeny's victories was not just his own victory. It was hope for his parents. It was an opportunity to change their lives. It was the path to a better future. And precisely because of that, the pressure grew heavier with each passing year. By the time he entered his teenage years, Yevgeny Kafelnikov had become a different person. That boy no longer easily shared emotions with others, no longer sought sympathy, no longer expected anyone to understand what he was going through. On the outside, he looked calm and stronger than his real age. But inside, many emotions had been locked tightly behind invisible walls. Later, the whole world would call that coldness. Opponents would call it iron will. The press would call it Kafelnikov's special personality. But the truth was much more painful. It was just a boy who had learned to hide pain too early. A boy who had never really been taught how to show weakness. And those invisible scars would continue to follow him for the rest of his life. But those invisible scars would continue to follow him for the rest of his life. And right at the time when Yevgeny Kafelnikov was entering his teenage years, the world around him began to collapse in a way that no child could fully understand. In the late 1980s, the foundations that had held the Soviet Union firm for many decades began to shake. News of economic crisis appeared more and more. Long lines waiting to buy food became a familiar sight. Stores gradually emptied, money lost value. Promises of stability that had existed for an entire generation began to vanish before the eyes of millions of families. For many adults, it was a national crisis. But for children like Kafelnikov, it was a prolonged sense of insecurity that no one could clearly explain. Every day upon waking, the world became a little different. Every month that passed, the future became more uncertain. By 1991, when the Soviet Union officially dissolved, the lives of millions of families changed overnight. Systems that had existed for decades disappeared. The sports funding structures that young athletes depended on also began to falter. For young talents like Yevgeny, this was not simply political upheaval. It was a question of survival. For many years, the Soviet sports system had built and supported athletes from a young age. But now, everything became chaotic. Many training centers lacked funding. Many competitions were canceled or scaled back. Families who once believed sports would bring a future for their children now were no longer sure what lay ahead. It was a time when many young talents abandoned their dreams. Not because they lacked ability, but because they no longer had the conditions to continue. The Kafelnikov family was not outside that storm. They were not a wealthy family. They did not possess special resources. Every trip to compete was a big expense. Every new racket was a decision that had to be considered for a long time. The money earned became increasingly precious. Alexander Kafelnikov understood that time was running out. He knew that if his son could not rise in the coming years, The door of opportunity might close forever. That was why the already harsh training sessions became even harsher. The already heavy pressure became even greater. Yevgeny was no longer just training to defeat opponents his own age. He was training to hold on to his own future. There were days when the practice court became the only place where he felt life still had something he could control. While the outside world changed by the hour, the racket was still there. The balls still flew over the net. The exercises still continued to repeat. Tennis became the only refuge amid a period full of instability. But that safety also came with a very high price. While peers his age began to think about school, work, or other choices for the future, Kafelnikov had almost no other choices. Success was no longer a desire. It became an obligation. It became a responsibility. It became the only path he saw ahead. Each competition now carried a different meaning. A loss was no longer simply a loss. It was like a step back from the future the whole family was trying to build. Each victory brought hope. Each failure brought fear. And that pressure gradually grew along with his talent. When Kafelnikov began to be mentioned as one of the most promising young tennis players in Russia, expectations also increased exponentially. Relatives began to trust more. Coaches expected more. Those around him saw him as an opportunity to prove that Russia could still produce champions in a time of chaos. But no one asked how that boy felt. No one asked if he was afraid or not. No one asked if those still young shoulders were strong enough to carry all those expectations or not. And just like in his childhood years, Yevgeny continued to do the only thing he knew. He stayed silent. He continued training. He continued fighting. He continued hiding all worries behind the cold face that the world would later call will. But inside that teenager, the pressure was accumulating day by day, because he understood a truth that very few people his age could understand. If he failed, he would not just lose a match. He could lose the opportunity to change his entire life. And when the 1990s began to unfold before his eyes, Yevgeny Kafelnikov entered the professional tennis world with a baggage very different from many of his opponents. He did not carry the freedom of youth. He carried the expectations of his family. He carried the insecurity of a generation that grew up amid the collapse of an entire country. And he carried a silent promise that at all costs he must succeed. And he carried a silent promise that at all costs he must succeed. When entering the ATP Tour in the early 1990s, Yevgeny Kafelnikov quickly realized that the outside world was even harsher than everything he had experienced in Sochi. Tennis courts in Europe, North America, and Australia were completely different from the youth tournaments he had known. Opponents were not only more talented, they also came from richer countries, trained in more professional systems, and entered their careers with advantages that a young man from post-Soviet Russia could not have. For the first time in his life, Kafelnikov had to live almost year-round on flights. Airports became his second home. Hotels became the place he woke up every morning. There were weeks he did not remember which country he was in until he looked out the window or heard the language of those around him. The life that many people thought was glamorous was actually extremely lonely. While fans only saw matches lasting a few hours on television, most of a young tennis player's life took place in quiet hotel rooms, meals alone, and evenings with no one to talk to. The language barrier made the loneliness even heavier. Kafelnikov's English at that time was still limited. He could communicate enough to compete, but not enough to really connect with those around him. In the locker room, American players talked to each other. Australian players joked with each other. Groups of athletes from Spain, France, or Germany all had their own communities. But Kafelnikov often sat alone, observing, silent, and continuing to keep distance from the world. Many people later thought he was arrogant. Some thought he was cold. Others called him the most unapproachable person on the ATP Tour. But very few understood that most of that silence came from a feeling of being lost. He did not know how to fit in. He was not used to showing emotion, and he had spent too many years learning to endure alone. The first failures on the ATP Tour also came faster than he expected. There were tournaments where he was eliminated in the first round. There were matches where he felt he did not belong there at all. Western media at that time rarely paid much attention to a young player from Russia. In the eyes of many experts, he was just another new face who would appear and then disappear. No one believed that the quiet boy would change Russian tennis history. No one thought that one day he would stand at the top of the world. That doubt made the first victories even more precious. Each round overcome, each win against higher-rated opponents. Each step up the rankings was like a battle to prove his own existence. But initial success did not bring the happiness he had once imagined. The more he competed, the farther he was from his family. Calls back to Sochi became a fragile connection to his old life. There were birthdays he could not go home for. There were holidays he had to spend in a foreign country thousands of miles from his family. There were moments after victories, when the crowd cheered and cameras flashed continuously. The only thing he wanted was to sit in his family's small kitchen, like in his childhood years. But that became increasingly distant. Success was pulling him forward at a speed that even he could not control. When the ATP rankings began to record Kafelnikov's rapid progress, normal life also gradually disappeared. Each season became longer, each goal became bigger, each expectation became heavier. People began to call him the greatest hope of Russian tennis. But behind those praises was enormous pressure. Because each victory no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to his family. It belonged to the coaches. It belonged to the country that was thirsting to regain pride after years of upheaval. Kafelnikov did not talk much about it. He had never been someone who liked to recount his difficulties. But those close to him all noticed that the more successful he became, the more he withdrew into himself. The more famous he became, the lonelier he became. While opponents built close relationships on the tour, Kafelnikov still kept his distance. While others enjoyed the life of a young sports star, he continued to live as if everything could disappear at any moment. Perhaps part of him was still the boy who grew up during the instability of the Soviet Union. The boy who was always afraid that success would not last. The boy who always thought he had to keep fighting to hold on to what he had achieved. And it was that fear that drove him forward. But it also took away many other things. By the mid-1990s, Yevgeny Kafelnikov was no longer an unknown name. He had become one of the most dangerous tennis players in the world. Victories began to appear more frequently. The first titles began to come. But behind those advances was still a silent loneliness that very few noticed. Because sometimes the path to the peak is not as crowded as people imagine. Sometimes it is walked by only one person, and Yevgeny Kafelnikov had become familiar with that long before the world knew his name. And Yevgeny Kafelnikov had become familiar with that long before the world knew his name. But even he could not imagine that just a few years later, a tournament in Paris would change not only his own life, but also change the sports history of the entire country of Russia. The spring of 1996 came with increasingly great expectations. Kafelnikov was then only 22 years old. He had made strong progress on the ATP Tour and had proven that he was capable of competing with the top tennis players in the world. But in the eyes of most international experts, he was still not a real contender for the Grand Slam title. Names like Pete Sampras, Michael Chang, Thomas Muster, or Yevgeny Medvedev were the focus of all discussions. Kafelnikov was still seen as a talented player, but not big enough to make history. Perhaps that very thing helped him enter Roland Garros with a different mindset. Not noisy, not ostentatious, not seeking attention. Like most of his life, he just quietly competed and continued to advance. But behind that calmness was enormous pressure that few realized. Russia at that time was still struggling after the post-Soviet years. The country was looking for new symbols to believe in. Success stories could bring hope to millions of people, and in the sports world, no Russian male tennis player had ever won a Grand Slam. No one had done it. No one had opened that door. Kafelnikov understood that very clearly. Each round he overcame made the attention from home greater. Each victory made the expectations heavier. But like throughout his childhood years, he did not speak of those pressures. He just continued to compete. Match after match, point after point, step by step forward. When the tournament entered the second week, the whole world began to pay attention. The quiet boy from Russia was no longer just a surprise phenomenon. He had become a real threat. The accurate baseline shots, the astonishing stability under pressure, and especially the face that almost never changed emotion, whether winning or facing difficulties. People began to call him a machine. But no one knew that behind that cold appearance was a heart beating faster than ever. Because Kafelnikov understood he was standing before something no Russian tennis player had ever touched. When he advanced to the final rounds, Russian media began to follow each match like a national event. Those who had witnessed their country collapse just a few years earlier now found hope in each of his shots. And then that historic day also came. On the red clay courts of Roland Garros, Yevgeny Kafelnikov won the final against Michael Stich. The final moment happened almost too quickly. One shot, one score, one resounding cheer, and history was rewritten. For the first time in history, a Russian male tennis player became a Grand Slam champion. There are victories that change a career. There are victories that change a life. But that victory was even bigger than that. It changed the way the whole world viewed Russian tennis. In the following hours, Kafelnikov's name appeared on all the newspapers. Fans in Russia celebrated as if the country had just won a symbolic victory after many difficult years. A boy who had grown up amid the instability of the post-Soviet period now stood at the peak of one of the harshest sports on the planet. But the miracle did not stop there. While most tennis players would devote all their energy to men's singles, Kafelnikov still continued to compete in doubles. His body was already tired after 2 weeks of tension, but he still stepped onto the court, still fought. And then he and Daniel Vacek won the men's doubles title as well. That turned Roland Garros 1996 into one of the greatest tournaments of his career. In the same Grand Slam, he won both men's singles and men's doubles, an achievement so rare that many years later it was almost unrepeated. But sometimes the greatest success also brings the greatest burdens. From that day, Yevgeny Kafelnikov's life entered a completely different chapter. He was no longer a young tennis player trying to prove himself. He had become a national symbol, the pioneer, the one carrying the expectations of millions of Russians. What had once been a personal dream now turned into a public responsibility. Every subsequent tournament came with the pressure to continue winning. Every failure was analyzed like a major event. The whole country began to look to him as the guide for the future of Russian tennis. And it is painful to think that in the moment the whole world was celebrating that victory, a part of Yevgeny Kafelnikov's normal life was also gradually disappearing. Because from the day he lifted the trophy in Paris, he was no longer competing just for himself. He was competing for an entire country that placed its hopes on his shoulders. He was competing for an entire country that had placed its hopes on his shoulders. And in many cases, that was a burden even greater than any opponent standing on the other side of the net. After Roland Garros 1996, Yevgeny Kafelnikov's life changed completely. He was no longer a young tennis player seeking recognition. He had become the face representing Russian tennis around the world. Every time he entered a major tournament, people saw not only Kafelnikov, they saw an entire nation trying to assert its position in the new era. That brought pride, but it also brought enormous pressure that very few could understand. The late 1990s saw Kafelnikov enter the most excellent phase of his career. He continuously won titles, continuously advanced deep in Grand Slams, continuously appeared in the group of top tennis players in the world. But the closer he got to the peak, the more he realized a painful truth. No one cares how far you have gone. They only care if you can go even further. Victories that once made the whole country celebrate gradually came to be seen as natural. Titles once considered miracles became mandatory standards. And for someone who had already been used to creating pressure for himself, like Kafelnikov, that became an endless, prolonged battle. 1999 opened with the biggest opportunity of his career, the Australian Open, one of the four most prestigious Grand Slams in the world. The tournament every tennis player dreams of lifting the Champions Trophy. When Kafelnikov stepped into Melbourne that summer, he understood that he was standing before another historic opportunity. But he also understood that expectations had never been so great. Russian media continuously mentioned the possibility of him becoming world number one. Fans believed he could do what no one in Russian tennis history had ever done. Articles appeared every day. Interviews followed one after another. Predictions were constantly made. Meanwhile, Kafelnikov still did what he had always done throughout his life. Stay silent, train, compete, endure pressure alone. As he advanced round by round at the Australian Open, the attention grew greater. Each victory made the distance between him and history closer. And then in the final, Kafelnikov defeated Thomas Enquist to win his second Grand Slam title of his career. That moment should have been one of the happiest days of his life, and to some extent, it was. But at the same time, it also opened a completely new chapter, a chapter where success brought even greater pressures than before. Just a few months later, Yevgeny Kafelnikov officially became the world number one tennis player, the first in Russian tennis history to achieve that position. From Sochi to Moscow, from small tennis courts to national television programs, his name appeared everywhere. For Russia, that was a symbolic victory. A child who grew up during the difficult years of the post-Soviet period now stood at the peak of a global sport. But strangely, the closer he got to what he had once dreamed of, the more Kafelnik felt distant from normal life. Trips became longer, responsibilities more. Demands from sponsors, media, and fans grew larger. Life began to be measured by rankings, scores, and titles. Every week there was a new ranking. Every tournament had the pressure to defend the leading position. Every failure was analyzed like a disaster. There were mornings he woke up, and the first thing he thought about was not how he felt, but how many matches he needed to win to keep the number one position. Life gradually got caught in a vortex that was not easy to escape, and it was precisely in that period that the first signs of mental fatigue began to appear. Not physical fatigue. Kafelnikov was still strong enough to compete with the best tennis players in the world. What exhausted him was the feeling of always having to be perfect, always winning, always proving he deserved the position he had. There were no real days off. There was no time completely separate from pressure. Because when you are world number one, everyone wants to defeat you. And every time you step onto the court, you know that. Many fans look at the rankings and think the number one position is the happiest place. But for Kafelnikov, it was sometimes the loneliest place, because at the peak, there were not many people who really understood what you were going through. Those around celebrated victories. The press praised success. Fans called you a legend. But when night fell, when the stadiums became quiet, when the television lights went out, there was still only you facing pressures no one saw. There were nights Kafelnikov sat alone in a hotel room in a strange city, looking out the window and thinking about the path he had traveled. The boy in Sochi who once dreamed of competing with the best in the world. Now he had become the one at the top of the world. But instead of feeling relieved, he carried even more pressure than ever. That was the price no one talks about when mentioning champions. That was the price of becoming a pioneer, the first to open a door that no one had ever opened, and also the first to have to learn to live with the weight of history on his shoulders, and also the first to have to learn to live with the weight of history on his shoulders. But if there was one moment that made all of Russia truly believe that Yevgeny Kafelnikov had become a symbol of an era, it was the fall of 2000 at Sydney. The Olympics were always different from any other tournament. Grand Slams brought fame. The ATP brought ranking. Prize money brought stability. But the Olympics brought something completely different. It brought the feeling of representing an entire nation. When stepping into the Olympic Village in Australia, Kafelnikov was not just a tennis player looking for another title. He was the hope of Russia in an event that millions were following. By then, he had won Grand Slams, had become world number one, had achieved things that the boy in Sochi had once not dared to dream of. But there was still one big goal unfulfilled, an Olympic gold medal, a victory that could put his name in history in a different way. The first days in Sydney passed under familiar pressure. Each match carried enormous expectations. Each round made the distance to glory closer, but also made the fear of failure greater. Because at the Olympics, there was no chance to correct mistakes the following week. There was no other tournament right after to redo. 4 years of preparation could end after just one afternoon. Kafelnikov understood that more than anyone. He stepped onto the court with his familiar face. Calm, controlled, cold, but inside the pressure was weighing on every heartbeat. As the tournament progressed deep, he had to face the top players in the world. Each win consumed more energy. Each win made expectations at home greater. Russian fans began to believe he could do it. Newspapers continuously updated each result. Commentators talked about the historic opportunity, and once again, Kafelnikov stood between two worlds, an outside world that was expecting, and an inside world that was trying not to let the pressure swallow him. The final match finally came. The opponent was Tommy Haas, one of the brightest talents in world tennis at that time. It was not an easy match. Nothing was easy in Kafelnikov's journey. After many hours of tension, after long rallies, after moments where every mistake could change history, he won. When the final score closed, Yevgeny Kafelnikov fell to the court. A brief moment, but enough to release all the pressure accumulated over many years. He had done it. Olympic champion, a title that very few tennis players in history could touch. In Russia, millions celebrated. Images from Sydney appeared on all the news. For a country still looking for success stories in a difficult transitional period, that victory meant far more than sports. It was pride, it was hope, it was proof that Russia could still produce the greatest champions in the world. And in that moment, Yevgeny Kafelnikov became a national hero. But sadly, life does not operate the way movies often tell. Success does not always heal the wounds inside a person. Trophies do not always bring peace. When the celebrations ended, when the articles moved on to other topics, when the television lights gradually went out, Kafelnikov still had to return to himself. He was still the man who had spent most of his youth in strange hotels, still the man who spent most of his life on planes and practice courts, still the man who had sacrificed so much to reach the peak. And the more successful he became, the clearer the voids in his personal life became. The years away from family could not be regained. The missed relationships could not return. The emotions buried from childhood were still there. Kafelnikov had once thought that if he was successful enough, everything would become easier, that one day victory would bring a feeling of completeness. But after Sydney, he began to realize a different truth. Each peak only brought joy for a short time. After that, life continued. New pressures appeared, new worries appeared, new questions appeared, and sometimes the feeling of loneliness also returned faster than people thought. The world saw an Olympic champion. They saw the medals, the speeches, the victory photos, but they did not see the long, lonely nights in hotel rooms. They did not see the man still trying to understand why all the greatest successes of his life did not bring the peace he had once sought. Perhaps that is the most painful thing about champions. They spend their whole lives climbing to the top of the mountain, and when standing there, they realize that some voids in the soul cannot be filled with gold medals. And for Yevgeny Kafelnikov, those voids would soon become much larger cracks in his private life. And for Yevgeny Kafelnikov, those voids would soon become much larger cracks in his private life. Because while the whole world saw the titles, the trophies, and the historic victories, there was another part of his life quietly happening outside the court lights. That was the part of life he always tried hardest to protect: family. In the late 1990s, when Kafelnikov's name had become famous around the world, he met Maria Tishkova. She was beautiful, charming, and completely different from the harsh tennis world he had lived in since childhood. After many years of only knowing practice courts, planes, hotels, and tournaments, Maria's appearance was like a gentle, quiet moment in his life. Those close to him said it was rare to see Kafelnikov as comfortable and cheerful as in that period. For a person famous for being reserved, showing little emotion, and always keeping distance from the world around him, opening up to someone had never been easy. But Maria did what not many people could. She made him feel he was not just a tennis player, not just a champion, not just the one carrying the expectations of the whole country, but simply a man looking for happiness like anyone else. When they got married, Kafelnikov truly believed he had finally found what was missing in his life. After all the years of loneliness on the ATP Tour, after countless intercontinental flights and long nights in strange hotels, he began to imagine a stable home, a place to return to, a place without ATP rankings, without pressure from the media, without cheers that then disappeared right after the match. Just family. And then that happiness became more complete when their daughter, Alesya, was born. For Kafelnikov, that was a special moment in a way no trophy could bring. He had once lifted Grand Slam titles, had stood at the top of the world, had won Olympic gold. But the first time holding his daughter in his arms brought a completely different emotion, an emotion he had never experienced. Those who knew Kafelnikov in that period all said that Alessia quickly became the center of his world. The man once famous for being cold on the court became soft every time he talked about his daughter. After many years living under the pressure to win, for the first time he felt there was something more important than tennis. But sadly, life did not allow him to enjoy that as long as he wished. Kafelnikov's career at that time was still at its peak. Tournaments continued one after another without stopping. Trips lasting weeks, then months, still continued. When one tournament ended, another began. When he had just returned home, a new schedule appeared. The ATP Tour did not wait for anyone, and champions are often the ones who have to sacrifice the most. At first, Kafelnikov believed he could balance everything. He believed he could be both world #1 tennis player, a good husband, and a good father. But reality was much more cruel. Each week of competition was a week away from family. Each month of competition was a month missing moments that could not be returned. There were birthdays. There were holidays. There were important moments in his daughter's life that he could only hear about over the phone. The distance began to appear silently. There were no big events right away. There was not a single moment that made everything collapse. It was just day after day passing, their lives gradually going in different directions. While Kafelnikov lived on planes and courts, Maria had to face most of the responsibilities of family life. While he tried to maintain his position as one of the best tennis players in the world, the family needed more of his presence. And that was the conflict that many top athletes had experienced: how to belong to the whole world but still belong to one's own family. The first signs of cracks began to appear. Conversations became shorter. Misunderstandings appeared more. Silences lasted longer. Kafelnikov tried to focus on his career because that was what he had done all his life. But deep inside, he began to feel a familiar fear, the fear of losing what he cherished most. He had once feared failure on the court, had feared not being good enough to change his life, had feared disappointing his family. But now he feared something else. He feared that the home he had spent many years building was gradually slipping out of reach. It is painful to think that in the period when the whole world saw a champion at the peak of power, Yevgeny Kafelnikov began to experience long nights of worry about his own family. Because sometimes the hardest battles do not take place on the court. They take place in the very home that we always believe will exist forever. And unfortunately, that battle had only just begun. There was no specific day when Yevgeny Kafelnikov woke up and knew that his marriage had ended. Things like that rarely happen suddenly. They usually begin with very small distances, a missed conversation, a return home too late, a trip that lasted longer than expected, an unexplained silence. Then over time, those small distances gradually grew into walls that no one knew how to break down. By the early 2000s, the pressure accumulated over many years finally began to leave consequences. Kafelnikov's and Maria's lives seemed to drift further and further apart. He still lived in the world of tournaments, flights, and goals that continued non-stop, while Maria faced a different reality. A family life where the most important man was frequently absent. Both had their own disappointments. Both carried their own wounds. But instead of finding each other, they increasingly lost each other. The most painful thing was that neither of them entered the marriage with the intention of failing. Kafelnikov had truly believed that this family would last forever. After a childhood grown up under pressure and loneliness, he always wanted to build a more stable home for himself. He wanted Alesya to have the things he himself had never had. He wanted his daughter to grow up in love and safety. But life does not always allow the simplest dreams to become reality. When the marriage officially broke up, it was not just the end of a relationship. For Kafelnikov, it was like the collapse of a part of his life that he had spent many years building. The divorce papers could be completed in a few months, but the wounds they left often lasted for many years. And in Kafelnikov's case, everything became even more difficult because he was not an ordinary person. He was the most famous person in Russian tennis at that time. That meant his private pain quickly became a public topic. Russian media followed every development of the separation. Articles appeared continuously. Speculation spread widely. Stories about his personal life were discussed on television, in the press, and everywhere on the internet. Fans who had once seen Kafelnikov lift the biggest trophies in the world now witnessed him entering a completely different battle. A battle with referee. No clear rules, no real winner. For many years, Kafelnikov had learned how to deal with competition pressure. He knew how to overcome tense matches, knew how to control emotions at decisive moments. But there was no training course that prepared him for facing the breakdown of his family. There was no tactic that helped him repair what had shattered. For the first time in many years, Kafelnikov felt helpless. On the tennis court, if he lost a match, he could return to training and try harder. But in private life, not every failure had a chance to be fixed. There were things that once lost would never return as before. And what pained him the most was not what he himself lost. It was what his daughter had to go through. Alessia at that time was still too young to understand everything that was happening. But children always sensed the things adults tried to hide. The arguments, the silences, the changes in daily life, all left marks. Kafelnikov began to look at his daughter with eyes full of anxiety. He feared that the conflicts between the adults would create wounds that Alesya would carry for life. He feared that his daughter would have to grow up in a divided world. He feared that he was failing in the most important role of his life. In the following years, that pain did not disappear. On the contrary, it continued to smolder like a fire that never went out. Every time he saw Alessia, he wondered if he could have done something differently. If there was any moment in the past when he should have chosen differently. If all the titles, victories, and sacrifices were really worth it if in the end he still could not keep his family by his side. The public still saw a strong Kafelnikov. The press still mentioned his great achievements. Fans still called him a legend. But behind all that was a man trying to survive one of the darkest periods of his life. Because sometimes the most painful losses are not what happens on the court. They happen in the very places we once called home. And for Yevgeny Kafelnikov, the real storm had not yet ended. Because after the broken marriage, he was about to enter an even more painful battle. A battle that he believed would decide the rest of his life. The battle to hold on to the only thing he could not accept losing, his daughter. The battle to hold on to the only thing he could not accept losing, his daughter. After all the titles, victories, and years living under the spotlight of world sports, Yevgeny Kafelnikov entered a phase that no coach could prepare him for. Not a Grand Slam final, not a competition for the world #1 position, but the battle to be by his daughter's side. When the marriage ended, everything did not stop at the legal papers. The prolonged tensions continued to be present in daily life. Disagreements about Alesya's future gradually became the center of every argument. What had once been a family was now divided into two sides, and in the middle of it all was a little girl still too young to understand why the people she loved most could not be together. For Kafelnikov, that was a painful period in a way that no failure on the tennis court could compare to. On the court, he always knew what he needed to do. If the opponent was stronger, he would train more. If he made a mistake, he would fix it in the next match. But in this battle, there were no clear scores, no simple rules, no absolute victory. Every decision left damage to someone, and each passing day made him feel he was drifting further from the life he had once dreamed of. The legal battle over custody and raising Alessia lasted longer than he had ever imagined. Meetings with lawyers, tense working sessions, and endless arguments gradually replaced the rhythm of life he had once been familiar with. The man who had once spent most of his time studying opponents and preparing tactics now had to spend hours facing issues he had never wanted to happen. Many people looked at Kafelnikov's bank account, titles, or fame and thought he had everything to overcome difficulties. But they did not understand that money could not buy peace, fame could not mend a broken family, and status could help a father sleep well when worrying about his daughter. In those years, Alessia became the center of Kafelnikov's world. Every plan revolved around his daughter. Every decision began with the question of what was best for her. There were trips he refused. There were opportunities he passed up. There were periods when he almost set aside many parts of his personal life to focus on his role as a father. The public did not see those things. The press usually only cared about attention-grabbing headlines, but behind the articles were countless silent sacrifices that only those close to him understood. There were evenings when Kafelnikov sat for hours just to talk with his daughter. There were days he canceled all personal plans to be with Alessia. There were moments when he tried to be both father and mother in the little girl's life. Those were not things that brought titles, did not bring prize money, did not bring applause. But to him, they were more important than any victory he had ever had. When his playing career gradually came to an end, many athletes fell into a feeling of emptiness because they lost the biggest goal of their lives. But for Kafelnikov, it was somewhat different. Tennis had once been the center of his life, but now love for his daughter had replaced that position. Alessia became the reason that kept him moving forward in the hardest days, became the motivation that helped him wake up every morning, even when his private life was full of turmoil. In many later interviews, Kafelnikov rarely talked much about the suffering he had to endure. But every time he mentioned his daughter, people could feel something different in his voice, a rare softness, a very real anxiety, and above all, the unconditional love that a father has for his child. There were times when he truly believed the family could still be saved in some way. Maybe not by going back to the past, maybe not by mending everything that had broken, but at least by keeping Alessia growing up in love instead of hatred. That was the belief that helped him continue to endure through those years full of pressure. That was the hope he never wanted to give up. But life often tests people in ways no one can predict. Kafelnikov had fought for many years to protect his daughter's future. He believed those sacrifices would be enough to keep her away from the storms that the outside world might bring. He believed that a father's love would help his daughter find the right path. Yet as time passed, Alessia began to grow up. And just like many other parents, Kafelnikov gradually realized a painful truth. At some point, you can no longer control your child's life. You can only stand by, pray, and hope. And it was precisely that moment that opened the most painful chapter in Yevgeny Kafelnikov's entire life. A chapter that even the man who had once conquered the peaks of the world did not know how to overcome. A chapter that even the man who had once conquered the peaks of the world did not know how to overcome. Throughout his life, Yevgeny Kafelnikov had become accustomed to facing pressure. He had once stepped onto the court in front of tens of thousands of spectators, had once carried the expectations of all of Russia on his shoulders, had once played matches where just a few points could change history. But none of that prepared him for the pain of watching his daughter gradually drift away from a father's protective arms. When Alessia entered adulthood, she quickly attracted public attention. With her striking beauty, ideal height, and captivating presence, Alesya Kafelnikova quickly became one of the most prominent young faces in the Russian fashion world. Magazines began featuring her photos. Fashion brands began to notice her. Praises appeared more and more. For any father, that should have been pride. And at first, Kafelnikov truly felt that way. He had once believed his daughter was building a bright future, an independent life, a personal path not overshadowed by the too large shadow of her famous father. But along with that very quick fame came a completely different world, a world that Kafelnikov could not control. A world full of temptations, pressure, and people who did not always have good intentions. As Alessia appeared more and more in the media, rumors also began to appear. At first they were just small stories, rumors about romantic relationships, late-night parties, the luxurious lifestyle that young models were often drawn into. But over time, those stories became increasingly serious. Tabloid pages continuously published controversial information. Photos appeared on social media. Discussions spread widely across Russia. And each time, Kafelnikov felt his heart grow a little heavier. For many years, he had tried to protect his daughter from the wounds he himself had experienced. He had fought to be by her side, had sacrificed so much time, energy, and emotion to ensure Alessia had a good future. But now, he began to realize that there were battles a father could not fight for his child. Russian media almost followed Alessia's every step. Every new relationship became a headline. Every photo became a topic of debate. Every rumor quickly spread on the internet. And the most painful thing was that Kafelnikov had to witness it all while having almost no way to stop it. There were days he woke up and saw his daughter's name appearing across all the newspapers. There were days the phone continuously received messages from friends, acquaintances, or reporters. There were days he felt the whole country was talking about his daughter in a way no father would want. For many years, Kafelnikov had always maintained a strong image in public. He rarely showed emotion, rarely complained, rarely allowed others to see his hurt. But this period changed everything. The posts he shared on social media made fans truly worried. For the first time, they saw a completely different Yevgeny Kafelnikov. No longer the cold champion, no longer the invincible man, but a desperate father trying to call for help in silence. In a share that shocked Russian public opinion, he even admitted he was going through one of the worst periods of his life. Those words left millions stunned, because they had never seen Kafelnikov talk about his pain in that way. After everything he had overcome in his career, what made him collapse was not an opponent on the court, not a failure at a Grand Slam, but the fear of gradually losing connection with his daughter. That was a painful feeling that many parents could understand. The feeling of watching the child you love most step into choices you do not agree with. The feeling of wanting to help but not knowing how. The feeling of wanting to protect but no longer having enough power to protect. For Kafelnikov, it was like standing outside the court and watching an important match take place without being allowed to step in. He could see the danger, could see the consequences, could see what was happening. But he could not change it all with his own will. And that made him more helpless than at any other time in his life. Those years became the harshest mental battle he had ever experienced, harsher than Grand Slam finals, harsher than the races for the world #1 position, harsher than any pressure tennis had ever brought. Because on the court, he always knew when the match ended. But in this battle, no one knew when things would get better. No one knew if the wounds could be completely healed or not. No one knew if a father's love would be enough to pull his daughter back or not. There were nights when Kafelnikov barely slept. There were days he lived in anxiety. There were moments he wondered if he had done something wrong on the journey of being a father. If there was anything he should have done differently. If all those years of fighting to protect his daughter had really been enough or not. And while the world still continued to remember him as the Olympic champion, the Grand Slam champion, and the Russian tennis legend, Yevgeny Kafelnikov was going through a completely different battle. A battle with no audience, no cheers, no trophy at the end of the road. Only the love of a father trying to hold on to the most precious thing in his life before it disappeared from his reach forever. Only the love of a father trying to hold on to the most precious thing in his life before it disappeared from his reach forever. But even the fiercest emotional battles eventually had to give way to time. The years passed. Alesya gradually grew up. Life continued to move. And Yevgeny Kafelnikov also entered a new chapter that he had never really prepared for. The chapter called Life After Tennis. For more than 2 decades, he woke up every day with a clear goal: train, compete, win. The ATP rankings decided the rhythm of his life. Grand Slams divided time into seasons. Every plan revolved around tennis. Every sacrifice had a reason to exist. But then one day, it all stopped. No more flights to Melbourne in January. No more tense weeks in Paris. No more noise from the Wimbledon Centre court. No more of stepping onto the court amid the cheers of tens of thousands of spectators. No more post-match press conferences. No more rankings updated every week. What many fans never understood was that the hardest part of retirement was not when you made the decision. The hardest part was the morning after, when you woke up and realized the world continued to operate without needing you. Kafelnikov had spent almost his entire adult life becoming an athlete. That was not just a job. That was his identity. That was how he saw himself. And now, for the first time in decades, he had to ask himself a simple but terrifying question. If he was no longer a tennis player, who was he? The first years after retirement brought a feeling of emptiness that very few saw. On the outside, his life was still enviable. He was wealthy, famous, respected. His name had been written into Russian sports history. But inside, a large void began to appear. Many mornings passed without a specific goal. No tournament ahead. No opponent to study. No new challenge to conquer. For a person accustomed to living in a continuously competitive environment, the silence was sometimes even scarier than pressure. That was why Kafelnikov began to look for new goals. Poker became one of his greatest passions. That game brought a familiar feeling: calculation, pressure, split-second decisions. The competitive feeling he had lived with for many years. There was a period when he spent a lot of time on professional poker, participating in international tournaments, and challenging himself in a completely different environment. To many people, that seemed surprising. But for Kafelnikov, it was a way to fill the void that tennis had left. Besides, poker was golf, a sport completely different from the brutality of the ATP Tour. No more serves over 200 kilometers per hour. No more hours-long battles of strength. Only the quiet of the golf course and long periods for reflection. Many years later, those who had met Kafelnikov on the golf course often remarked that he looked calmer than during his playing days. But that calmness did not appear immediately. It was the result of a long process of learning to accept that life had moved to a different chapter. Even so, there were days when the past still returned. There were afternoons when he saw a Grand Slam match on television and involuntarily remembered the glorious years. There were times he remembered the feeling of stepping onto the court with tens of thousands of spectators waiting. There were moments he remembered the simplicity of his previous life, when everything revolved only around winning the next match. Nostalgia became a familiar companion, not because he wanted to live in the past, but because the past had occupied most of his life. Old photos, trophies, videos from Roland Garros, the Australian Opens, or Olympic Sydney, all reminded him of a different version of himself. A younger version, stronger, and perhaps also less wounded. But over time, Kafelnikov began to understand that life was not a battle against change. It was a journey of learning to accept change. He was no longer the boy from Sochi trying to prove himself. No longer world number one. No longer the one who had to carry the expectations of the whole country every time he stepped onto the court. And that did not mean his life had ended. It only meant one chapter had closed. Learning to live without the spotlight. Learning to find value in ordinary things. Learning to enjoy a quiet morning without thinking about the ATP rankings. Learning to accept what had been lost and be grateful for what remained. That was Yevgeny Kafelnikov's new battle. A battle with no opponent on the other side of the net, no referee, no audience. Only a man trying to find meaning in life after the applause had stopped ringing. And it was precisely in those years that he began to look back on his entire journey from a different perspective. A perspective that made him realize there were things that even the biggest trophies in the world could never repair. If trophies are what people see, then the cracks inside are what no one really wants to face. Simon Cowell had built an entire entertainment empire based on his ability to spot others' talent, turning unknown voices into global stars, turning fragile dreams into billion-dollar television programs. But when the lights went out, when the applause stopped, no trophy could repair the shattered parts of life behind the fame. Looking back on his career, Simon once possessed all the things the world called success. From American Idol to The X Factor, from Got Talent to hundreds of international versions, he was not just the one who created the shows, he was the one who redefined the way the world viewed talent. Hundreds of millions of viewers had followed every frown, every sharp comment from him, as if it were the final judgment on a person's worth. But in the very moment of that power, a silent paradox existed. The man who could decide the fate of thousands of contestants could not control the cracks in his own private life. Behind the brilliant stages was a family life that had once been forgotten, relationships strained by the pressure of fame, and an emotional void that no amount of money could fill. When Simon became the symbol of ruthless success on television, he also simultaneously became a lonelier person than ever. Praises from the audience could not replace the silence in hotel rooms after each filming session. Rounds of applause could not warm the long nights when he faced himself. His success was real, but the feeling of emptiness was just as real. The most painful thing was not in the fame, but in its price. Simon had once traded closeness, stability, and even the most ordinary moments of life to build a global entertainment empire. He became the person the whole world wanted to hear, but there were no longer many people who truly understood who he was outside the spotlight. The breakdown did not come in one day, but accumulated over the years. Fractured relationships, family distances, times choosing work over presence with loved ones, all gradually created a type of wound that did not bleed but never healed. When looking back, the trophies, television records, million-dollar contracts, all were still there, but they could not speak for what had been lost. Even when becoming one of the most powerful people in the television industry, Simon Cowell still had to face a simple but cruel truth. Success does not equal happiness. There are peaks where, when standing on them, people find themselves far from all the things that once made them feel they belonged. And perhaps that is something no trophy can repair, no show can fill, no round of applause can replace. Because what has broken in personal life does not belong to the stage, but to the silences behind the spotlight, where no one applauds and no one awards prizes. Simon Cowell had changed the entertainment world, but that world had also changed him in an irreversible way. And in that journey, what remained was not only a television empire, but also a person forced to learn to live with what fame could never heal. Looking back on the peak years of Yevgeny Kafelnikov's career, He no longer saw them under the glamorous light that the public had once seen. The Grand Slam titles, the weeks at world number one, the victories against the strongest opponents on the planet, all no longer took the form of pure glory. They became milestones paid for with something he only truly understood when his career had drifted far: the trade-offs. For many years, Kafelnikov was the symbol of a transitional generation. He was not only a top tennis player, but also the one who paved the way for Russian tennis to enter the world map. But that very role also became a burden that few saw. When people talked about him as the pioneer, they usually only mentioned success. They did not talk about the pressure to prove that that success was not luck. Did not talk about the feeling of having to win not just for himself, but for an entire country looking for its place in global sports. Kafelnikov once admitted, many years after retirement, that he had lived in a state that at the time he did not have the language to name. It was not just competition pressure. It was the feeling of always having to maintain a standard that was not allowed to drop, because behind him was an entire generation looking to him. Each match was not just a contest, but a test of honor. And when you won too much, people began to think that you were never allowed to lose again. What the public saw were the trophies. What Kafelnikov felt was the exhaustion that continued without stopping even after the match ended. There were nights he returned to the hotel after a victory, but instead of joy, he only felt emptiness. The victory was no longer the destination, but became an obligation that had to be repeated. And when obligation replaced emotion, even glory became heavy. His greatest victories, Roland Garros, the Australian Open, historic Davis Cup matches, all came with sacrifices that no one recorded in the statistics. The years of youth spent on practice courts, relationships pushed to the side, family moments that could never be regained. He did not talk about that during his peak period, not because he did not see it, but because he was not allowed to see it. In elite sports, looking back sometimes meant slowing down, and slowing down was the risk of being left behind. The hardest thing, as he admitted later, had never taken place on the tennis court. Opponents on the court could be defeated by tactics, physical strength, or will. But the real battle took place in silence, between the person he was now and the person he could have become if not swept into the grind of success too early. That was the battle between becoming a champion and keeping a part of himself from being swallowed by titles. There was a truth that it took him many years to have the courage to face. He had traded his youth without really understanding the price. While still competing, that was covered by adrenaline, by the dense schedule, by the media's praise. But when everything stopped, the silence began to speak. And in that silence, the questions were no longer obscured. If I had not become a professional tennis player, what would my life have been like? If I had slowed down a little, could I have kept more of what I lost? And most importantly, did all those victories really belong to me, or to the expectations of others? Family was always the hardest part to talk about in Kafelnikov's story. Not because he did not love them, but because the time for them was always divided by flights, tournaments, exhausting training sessions. He had admitted many times that when young, he believed he was doing the right thing for everyone's future. But the future, when it arrived, could never compensate for the lost years. There were moments he remembered very clearly: missed birthdays, short calls from hotels, times when people grew up without him witnessing. And the most painful thing was not the absence, but the fact that that absence gradually became normal. His youth also did not belong to him in the way people usually think. It was shaped by discipline, by the pressure of international competition, by always having to maintain a strong image. While others explored the world, he explored the courts. While others made mistakes to learn how to grow up, he did not have much space for mistakes. And when there were no mistakes, growing up sometimes came later, but heavier. Only when away from tennis did Kafelnikov begin to look back on that entire journey as a series of choices that before he had never had time to analyze. Not every choice was wrong. Not every success was empty. But the truth was, no victory was completely free. What he learned, after all, was not in the number of titles, but in the belated understanding that success and loss were never separate. They always went together, like two sides of the same road. And sometimes, the price of standing at the peak was having to learn to live with the voids that no title could fill. When looking back, Kafelnikov no longer tried to justify the past. He also did not try to rewrite it. He only acknowledged it as it was, a brilliant journey, but not complete. A career to be proud of, but not immune to its price. And perhaps the bravest thing he had ever done was not stepping onto the biggest courts in the world, but being calm enough to admit that behind all the spotlight, there always existed a story that audiences never fully saw. The story of the things that had been traded so the light could exist. And perhaps the bravest thing he had ever done was not stepping onto the biggest courts in the world, but being calm enough to admit that behind all the spotlight, there always existed a story that audiences never fully saw. The story of the things that had been traded so the light could exist. And when looking back on that entire journey, Yevgeny Kafelnikov no longer saw it as a simple series of victories. He saw a long road, full of scratches, beginning from a boy in Sochi and ending at peaks that very few in history could reach. From the simple practice courts by the Black Sea, where a boy had to learn to hit balls under the strictness of his father coach, to the most brilliant courts in the world, where tens of thousands of spectators stood up cheering his name, Kafelnikov had gone through a journey that not many athletes of the same generation could repeat. He became the first Russian Grand Slam champion, the first to bring Russian men's tennis onto the world map, the first to stand at the ATP #1 position and win Olympic gold. Those milestones were not just personal achievements, but also historical markers for an entire sport that was transforming after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But behind those milestones were things that never appeared on the scoreboard. Were the years of youth defined by discipline instead of freedom? Were the continuous trips that made him grow up more in hotels than in a fixed home? Were the relationships interrupted by the competition schedule and the family moments that could never be regained? His success always came with the absence of something else: peace, stability, and sometimes even the feeling of belonging. Kafelnikov was not the only one in sports who had to pay the price for glory, but his story carried a special shade, because he was the pioneer. When you are the first to open the door, you have no one ahead to learn from. You step through the limits yourself, endure pressures that have never been shaped yourself. And when you succeed, you bring not only personal fame, but also the expectations of an entire generation behind. There was a period in his career when he lived in a state where victory no longer brought relief. It was only confirmation that you were still good enough to continue being expected. And failure was not just a sports result, but a question of personal worth before the public, before the media, and before the very country you represented. It was that interweaving that made the battle inside him never really end, even when the match had closed. But what made Kafelnikov's story deeper was not only in the past, but also in the way he faced it as time passed. When the court lights went out, when his professional career ended, he did not disappear. He did not deny what had happened. He learned to live with it. And more importantly, he learned to look back at it with an understanding that only time could bring. The relationship with his daughter Alessia, which had gone through tense and distant periods, also gradually entered a different chapter. Not a perfect or easy change, but a process of growth from both sides. The turbulent years had left marks, but also created opportunities to understand each other more deeply. For Kafelnikov, that was more important than any title he had ever won, because for the first time in his life, he no longer had to fight on the court, but fight to keep the most meaningful thing off the court. When looking back on the entire journey, what he realized was not simple regret, but a much more complex truth. There was no victory without trade-offs, no glory that was completely free, but there was also no loss that made the entire journey meaningless. because it was precisely those wounds, those voids, and those years of loneliness that created the person the world called a legend. Yevgeny Kafelnikov's legacy was not only in the statistics, the trophies, or the positions on the rankings. It lay in the fact that he had opened a path that no one had walked before. It lay in the fact that he had proven that a tennis player from a transforming country could still stand at the top of the world. And it lay in the fact that he had survived all the pressures, expectations, losses, and wounds that success brought. There are people remembered because they won, but there are also people remembered for how they paid to win. And Kafelnikov belonged to both worlds at the same time. When looking back at the boy in Sochi back then, who had stepped onto the practice court with small hands and a future no one had shaped, it was hard to imagine that he would go that far. But what was more worth saying was not how far he had gone, but that he had continued to walk, even though that road was full of invisible scratches. And in the end, that was exactly what made Yevgeny Kafelnikov not just a champion, not just a world number one, but a man who had gone through glory, loss, loneliness, and even healing, to then learn to accept that the price of greatness was never measured only by trophies, but by what you still kept after all the lights had gone out. Yevgeny Kafelnikov is not only remembered as a tennis champion, but also as a person who had to pay a very high price for the greatness he achieved. From the boy who grew up in Sochi during the dissolution of the Soviet Union, he stepped out into the world with empty hands, but carrying a will forged by harsh discipline and non-stop pressure. He became the first Russian tennis player to win a Grand Slam, reach world number one, and win Olympic gold, milestones that an entire later generation could rely on to believe that Russians could stand at the top of world tennis. But behind that spotlight were the long years of loneliness on flights, in hotels, and in his own mind, where no applause could reach. The trophies he lifted could not save the marriage that had broken, could not fill the void when he gradually lost connection with his daughter in the most turbulent years of his life. And there was no title that could erase the feeling of helplessness when standing between public glory and private wounds. Kafelnikov's story makes people realize that peak success is never just victory, but always comes with silent sacrifices that audiences do not see. There were days he stood at world number one but felt lonelier than ever, because the higher he climbed, the greater the distance from normal life. The years after retirement only made that clearer. When the cheers disappeared, only the real person remained facing the choices and regrets of the past. But in all those losses, Kafelnikov did not collapse. He learned to accept, learned to keep living, and most importantly, learned to face the wounds that titles could never heal. Perhaps the biggest lesson from his life for American people and the whole world does not lie in the number of titles, but in the truth that real success is not only measured by what you gain, but also by what you still keep after it all. Family, peace, and the ability to forgive yourself. And that is why Yevgeny Kafelnikov is not only a tennis legend, but also a living proof of the price of greatness in sports and in life. If you feel that Yevgeny Kafelnikov's story touches your heart, please hit subscribe and follow the channel so you do not miss the journeys behind the spotlight that few have ever known. Thank you for accompanying us until the end of the video, and see you again in the next story, where we continue to explore great lives but full of sacrifices and losses.